to the world. Chuka is just a name on a map of the Ladia Valley, but to those of us who have walked its paths, it is a village defined by the Great Sarda River. It's a small settlement, barely 10 plowlands in size, clinging to the right bank near where the Sarda meets the Ladia, coming in from the northwest. From the corner of the village, a single path stretches out, following a fire track for about a quarter mile before it splits like a fork in the road. One arm climbs steeply toward the ridge of Thak village, while the other cuts a diagonal line across the rugged hills toward Kotkindri, a village owned by the people of Chuka. It was along this Kotkindri path, in the winter of 1936, that the first shadow of the man-eater fell. I remember the story of a man driving 2 bullocks along that Kotkindri path. As he approached Chuka, a tiger suddenly stepped out onto the track, blocking his way. Most men would have been paralyzed by fear, but this villager showed a level of courage I truly admire. He threw himself between the predator and his cattle, swinging his wooden staff and shouting with everything he had. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. The bullocks took the chance to bolt for the village, but now the tiger was frustrated. It had lost its easy meal and turned its full predatory focus on the man. Under that heavy stare, the man's nerves finally broke, and he turned to run. The beast sprang, landing its full weight squarely across his shoulders. In my years in the jungle, I've seen this mistake too often. Turning your back and running from a big cat doesn't mean escape. It triggers a chase reflex that is almost impossible for a tiger to resist. The man survived by a stroke of pure luck. He had been carrying a heavy wooden plow across his neck and a thick bag of provisions on his back. Instead of sinking into his spine, the tiger's teeth and claws spent their force on the hard wood and the heavy fabric. This gave him the split second he needed to scramble free and sprint for his life. He reached Chuka alive, but he carried a jagged claw wound from his shoulder to his wrist for the rest of his days. A few weeks later, the tiger struck again. 2 men were returning from the market at Tanakpur, navigating the steep, grueling path to Kotkindri. They saw the tiger crossing 50 yards ahead of them. They were smart. They waited, giving the animal time to move off into the thickets, and then proceeded with loud shouts to keep the predator at bay. But this tiger was no longer behaving like a normal animal, as the lead man came abreast of a dense patch of cover. The tiger lunged. This man was also heavily burdened, carrying a large sack of jaggery, unrefined sugar, half on his head and half on his back. Once again, the tiger's teeth caught only the sack, dragging the heavy sugar down the hillside. The man was left untouched, but terrified. I often wonder what that tiger thought of his first 2 encounters with human prey, a wooden plow and a sack of sugar. They must have been the most unsatisfying kills of his life. But he was a quick learner. He realized that objects carried on the back were a hindrance. From that day on, he stopped attacking those with heavy burdens. He began to look for humans who were carrying nothing but their own lives. If you climb 3,000 feet above the heat of Chuka, you find yourself in Thak. It is a village of substance, far larger and more established. The history of this place is etched into the very land. Long before the British arrived, the Chand Rajas, the ancient rulers of Kumaon, granted these territories to the ancestors of the current villagers. They were appointed as the hereditary custodians of the Purnagiri temples, a role that brought both prestige and wealth. Their houses are solid, built to last generations, and their herds of cattle are among the largest in the hills. But on a sweltering morning in June of 1937, all that history and wealth meant nothing. The day began under a heavy, punishing sun. 7 men and 2 boys had moved the village cattle to an open area, about 200 yards to the west. By 10 in the morning, the temperature had reached a breaking point. The animals, seeking relief, began to drift away from the parched clearing toward the dark. One of the boys, a lad of 14, was sent in to turn the strays back toward the group. He walked into the shadows of the trees and disappeared. There is a strange, dangerous lethargy that takes hold during a Himalayan heat wave. Perhaps it was the heat, or perhaps it was the false sense of security provided by the group, but the men fell asleep. For 6 long hours, while the sun beat down, not a soul noticed the boy hadn't returned. At 4 in the afternoon, the silence was shattered. A kakar, the barking deer of these forests, began to call frantically from the edge of the jungle. To an experienced ear, a cocker's bark is a telegram of danger. They rarely alarm like that unless they have caught the scent or sight of a predator. The men jolted awake. They realized their cattle had now strayed deep into the thickets. They sent the second boy, also 14, to drive the herd back out. He had barely crossed the tree line when the jungle erupted. The cattle stampeded in a blind, thundering panic. They raced across an open ravine toward the village. In the middle of this chaos, right in front of the 7 men, the tiger lunged from the brush. It struck down a cow with terrifying force. The shouting of the men and the bellowing of the cattle drew the villagers out from their homes. Soon, a crowd gathered on the high ground overlooking the ravine. Among the crowd was a widow, the mother of the second boy. When she heard the men calling her son's name and realized he was still in the forest, she didn't wait for a search party. She ran straight into the jungle where the tiger had just been seen. It was only when the parents of the first boy arrived that the full scale of the tragedy became clear. They asked where their son was. In that moment, the 7 herders realized with horror that they hadn't seen the first boy since 10 that morning. Following the distraught mother, a party of men entered the ravine. They found the second boy first. He was lying where the tiger had left him after the cattle had rallied to his rescue. It is a sight I have seen before, cows and buffaloes attacking a tiger to save their own. But the tiger had been enraged by their interference. Under a nearby bush, the parents of the first boy found their son. He had been dead for hours and was partly eaten. Beside him lay a dead calf. I believe the boy, out of simple curiosity, had stumbled upon the tiger while it was already eating the calf. In the wild, a predator is most lethal when it is startled on its kill. It creates a defensive zone, a kill zone that it will guard with predatory fury. 2 young lives and 2 animals were lost that day. The news of the slaughter spread through Nainital and Almora like a wildfire, and for the first time, the demand for the tiger's end became a cry for justice. Despite the rising fear and the best efforts of local officials, the tiger remained a ghost. He seemed to know exactly when a machan, a hunting platform, was being built and where a rifle was waiting. It was just 200 yards above Tak village, in a small wheat field, where he struck his final blow. The crop had recently been harvested, leaving nothing but yellow stubble on the parched ground. In the center of this open space sat 2 brothers, orphans aged 10 and 12. They were grazing their few remaining cattle, sitting close together as the small often do when they feel the weight of a predator's eyes upon them. On the far side of that field was a light fringe of bushes. From there the mountain rose steeply for 1,000 feet. From any point on that ridge, the 2 boys sitting in the open were perfectly visible. As the afternoon wore on, a cow drifted toward those bushes. The boys, acting as one, stood up to drive it back toward the center. As the elder brother passed a single isolated bush, the tiger pounced. It had been lying in wait in the open daylight. The younger boy didn't stay to watch. He fled back to the village, collapsing in a group of men, his body shaking with sobs. When he could finally speak, he told us a big red animal had carried his brother away. It was the first tiger he had ever seen, and it would haunt his dreams forever. A search party was organized immediately, with a bravery I find truly remarkable. Those unarmed men followed the blood trail for a mile, deep into the shadowed depths of the dark ravine. But the sun was setting. In the Kumaon hills, The night belongs to the man-eater. They were forced to return. The next morning, a larger search was made. All that remained of the boy was his red cap and his torn, blood-stained clothes. That was the Chuka tiger's last human victim. But the terror he left behind had completely paralyzed the valley. It was at this point that the deputy commissioner, Mr. Ibbotson, and I joined forces. I remember the day we arrived at the boom above Baramdeo. It was a sweltering afternoon in April. We were exhausted, covered in a thick layer of dust from the long bus journey and sore in places I didn't care to mention. A cup of tea on the burning sands of the Sarda River helped restore our spirits. We set off on foot for Thule Gad, where our tents had been pitched. The next morning we faced the Sarda Gorge. The distance to Kaladhunga is only 8 miles, but it is a journey through a nightmare of stone. Years ago, a tramway had been blasted into these cliffs to move timber, but the floods had long since reclaimed the iron and wood. We were forced to climb the rock face by hand. It was a grueling 4 miles of rock climbing. A single slip or a handhold that gave way would have sent us plunging into the freezing emerald waters of the river below. We negotiated the gorge without mishap. We even stopped to catch 2 fish near a rock the size of a house that jutted into the current. We finally reached Kaladhunga. As the morning sun rose over the Nepal hills, the view was one of the most pleasing sights I have ever seen. But I could not fully enjoy it. I had been laid up with a bout of malaria. While I rested on the bank, I watched the Ibbotsons comb the river. I watched an osprey dive a dozen times only to be robbed in midair by a Pallas fish eagle, a stark reminder of the law of the jungle. Nothing is truly yours until you have the strength to keep it. The local village officials arrived with the news. The man-eater was still active near Thak. The time for fishing was over. The move to Chuka was made, and the final hunt had begun. When we arrived at Chuka to begin our campaign, we found that our 6 young male buffaloes sent up from Tanakpur as bait had already been tied out for 3 nights. But this tiger was a seasoned veteran, though his pug marks were seen near several of the animals. He hadn't touched a single one. It was a silent standoff. For the next 4 mornings we visited each bait, scanning the ground for clues. And in the evenings, I accompanied the men as they led the buffaloes back out into the darkening valley. On the 5th morning, the stalemate broke. A buffalo we had tied at the edge of the jungle near Thak, the very spot where those 2 young boys had been lost, was missing. When we arrived, we found the rope snapped. We followed the drag, and I noticed something immediately that chilled me. Usually, a tiger will drag his kill into the thickest, darkest part of the jungle to hide it, but this animal had taken his prey across an open patch of ground and up onto a rocky knoll. I realized he was deliberately avoiding the dense cover where he had been fired at and wounded with buckshot on 2 previous occasions. This wasn't just a predator, it was a student of human behavior. We found the buffalo wedged between 2 rocks. The tiger had tried to free it, but when the horns jammed tight, he had given up and eaten only a few pounds from the hindquarters, while casting about for tracks. I found a clear set of pug marks in a nearby buffalo wallow. It was a big male. The villagers had told me the man-eater had a broken tooth, claiming that on every one of his kills, a canine tooth would only bruise the skin without puncturing it. Looking at those tracks, I knew we were finally on the trail of the right animal. The only tree near the kill was a solitary jamun tree, growing right on top of the knoll. It wasn't an ideal spot. It stood in full view of the surrounding jungle, and any move I made would be visible to a watching tiger. I sent a man up to clear a few twigs that were blocking my view of the kill, but I had him do it with the utmost care. At 2:30 that afternoon, Ibbotson and his man, Sham Singh, walked into the jungle where some Khalij pheasants, the Himalayan bird, were chattering. Their job was to act as a distraction, making noise to suggest that people were still in the area. Once I was settled on my branch, they walked away, talking loudly to lead the tiger's ears away from my position. The hours that followed were some of the longest of my life. A kakar, or barking deer, started its sharp, repetitive alarm call nearby. In these hills, the kakar is our most reliable lookout. Its bark is a clear sign that a tiger is on the move. I sat motionless as the sun began to dip, watching the red glow fade from the Nepal hills across the Sarda. The village sounds died away, and a deep, expectant silence settled over the knoll. Then, near the wallow, the kakar barked again. The tiger was returning. I rested my rifle on a branch and waited, my finger light on the trigger. But the minutes stretched into an eternity. 200 yards up the hill, a final alarm bark rang out. My heart sank. The tiger had seen my man breaking those twigs earlier that morning. He hadn't come for the meat. He had spent the evening stalking me, realized the trap, and walked away into the night. I stayed in that tree until dawn, cramped and frozen. There is a strange period in the Indian jungle, usually between midnight and 4 in the morning, when a profound peace descends. It is as if nature ordains a temporary ceasefire. The killers sleep, and the hunted can finally close their eyes. As the first gray light touched the ridges, I descended from the tree and found a thermos of tea that Ibbotson had thoughtfully buried under a bush. As I drank it, I heard the tiger call 3 times from a hill half a mile away. It was a haunting, powerful sound, a reminder that in this game of life and death, the Chuka man-eaters still held the advantage. After that long, freezing night in the jamun tree, I returned to camp for a hot bath and a square meal. But there is little rest for a hunter when a man-eater is on the move. By 1 o'clock that afternoon, I was climbing the steep hill back toward Thak village. A sambar, the large forest deer, had been heard belling on the ridges above the village. I spent another night in a tree, this time over a live buffalo, but the tiger remained a shadow in the distance. He was nearby, but he was cautious. The breakthrough came when the men returned with news of our remaining baits. One buffalo tied at the lower end of a deep ravine had vanished. This was the same ravine where the search party had found the orphan boy's red cap weeks earlier. MacDonald, the divisional forest officer, had also seen fresh tracks in the area marks that matched the heavy measured stride of the tiger we were after. I set out with Sham Singh to recover the kill and, hopefully, the killer. Tracking a tiger that has already tasted human blood requires a specific kind of focus. You aren't just looking for footprints. You are looking for a broken blade of grass, a smear of blood on a leaf, or the direction of a bent twig. The tiger had been incredibly cunning. He had dragged that heavy buffalo for miles over the most punishing ground imaginable, moving through dense thickets and over jagged rocks. Eventually, I realized he had looped back, bringing the kill to a spot only 200 yards from where he had started. He had led us on a wild goose chase, perhaps to tire us out or to see if he was being followed. The ravine eventually narrowed into a bottleneck, a tight passage between walls of stone and earth, barely 10 feet wide. It was a natural trap. As I stepped toward the opening, a sound erupted that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of my bones. It was a deep, guttural growl, coming from behind a screen of dense bushes just 20 yards directly in front of me. In the open, a growl is a warning. In a restricted bottleneck like that, it is a promise of an attack. An unseen tiger growling at close range is the most terrifying sound in the jungle. It is the sound of a predator claiming his territory. I knew I couldn't move forward. The tiger held the high ground and the cover, signaling to my men to retreat. I began the agonizing process of walking backward. In the jungle, you never turn your back on a growl. You move slowly, keeping your eyes on the last place you saw movement, until you are clear of the strike zone. Once we were safe, I maneuvered the men up the left bank, which rose 30 feet high and offered no undergrowth for the tiger to hide in. The tables had turned, now we held the advantage of height. We sat in a row on the edge of the bank, scanning the opposite slope. The air was thick with tension. My men were breathing heavily, their excitement reaching a fever pitch. One of them eventually leaned over and whispered, "Ears." He pointed toward a patch of dry leaves 50 yards away. I looked, but saw nothing. A tiger's ears are small targets at that distance, and against the carpet of dead leaves. They were invisible to me. Suddenly, the tiger decided to move. He stood up and began to pick his way up the hillside as his head cleared a bush. I didn't wait. I fired. The heavy rifle roared. But as the smoke cleared, I saw the bullet had struck a rock behind him. Splintering into 1,000 pieces, the tiger leaped straight into the air in surprise, getting tangled in a massive creeper before breaking free and galloping into the depths of the forest. I found the long hairs the bullet had clipped and the torn creeper, but there was no blood. I had missed the shot. Despite the failure, we found the kill. The tiger had submerged the buffalo in a pool of water 4 feet deep, a clever tactic to keep the meat cool and protected from the insects. It was a frustrating end to the day, but it confirmed one thing. The tiger was still here, and he was growing more brazen with every hour. With the tiger from the ravine still at large, the atmosphere in our camp at Chuka was one of high alert. It was a time of punishing heat, with the shade temperature often soaring to a blistering 110 degrees. In such conditions, every movement is an effort, yet the hunt could not wait. Shortly after my miss in the Bottleneck Ravine, news reached us that a cow had been struck down in a wide-open valley on the far side of the Ladya River. Ibbotson was still away, so MacDonald and I set out to investigate. The men who found the cow had covered it with branches to hide it from vultures, but when we arrived, we saw that the tiger had already returned, dug the carcass out and carried it off without leaving a single trace of a drag. In a forest of giant sal trees with no undergrowth, finding a hidden kill is like searching for a needle in a haystack. It took us an hour of painstaking searching, guided only by the faint scent of decay and the stagnant heat, before we found the cow buried under a massive pile of dry leaves. MacDonald gallantly helped me put up a machan in a nearby tree, and after he returned to camp, I settled in for the wait. An hour later, the silence was broken by the sound of a small stone rolling down the steep hillside across the ravine. I watched as a tigress stepped into view, followed closely by 2 small cubs. It was immediately clear that this was a schoolroom in the wild. This was likely the first time these cubs had ever been led to a kill, and the mother was taking infinite pains to teach them the caution necessary for survival. They followed her step by step, freezing instantly whenever she stopped to listen. Even over the carpet of dry sal leaves, which are as brittle as tinder in April, they moved with a ghostly silence that was a marvel to witness. As I watched them, they provided me with the ultimate proof of an observation I have made throughout my life. Tigers have almost no sense of smell, despite the intense heat and the rotting meat just yards away. Those hungry cubs were completely lost. They ranged back and forth, passing within a foot of the hidden cow a dozen times. Yet they couldn't find it. The mother sat back on her haunches, watching them with a patient, watchful eye. It was only when the loud, persistent buzzing of blowflies gave away the location that the cubs finally lunged at the pile of leaves and began their meal. Once she was satisfied they were feeding, the mother turned onto her back, with her legs in the air, and went to sleep, her duty for the moment complete. This display of maternal education reminded me of a scene I had witnessed years prior near the foot of Mount Dras. I was scanning a sheer rock cliff for Thar, the most sure-footed of all Himalayan goats, when I saw a mother and her kid on a narrow ledge. The mother jumped down to a ledge 12 feet below that was barely inches wide. With a 1,000-foot drop into nothingness, the kid was terrified, running back and forth, peering over the edge but unable to find the courage to jump. 7 times that mother climbed back up to her young to encourage it. She showed no frustration, only a quiet, steady persistence. Finally, the kid abandoned itself to fate, jumped, and landed safely beside her. Instinct plays its part, but it is the infinite patience of the mother and the unquestioning obedience of the young that allows the wild folk to reach maturity. I did not know then that the very tigress I was watching that day would later be wounded by a hunter's bullet and, out of desperation, become a man-eater herself, spreading a new wave of terror through this very valley. The cycle of life and death in the Lade Valley seemed to turn on a pivot of endless heat. 4 mornings after my time watching the tigress and her cubs, a messenger arrived from the headman of Thok. His face was etched with a familiar mix of exhaustion and hope. Another buffalo had been taken. This one had been tied at the very head of the valley, a few 100 yards west of the village, almost exactly where the first kill had occurred weeks prior. Ibbotson and I didn't hesitate. Despite the blistering temperature, we began the long, punishing climb back up the 3,000-foot ridge toward Thok. By the time we reached the village at midday, my clothes were saturated with sweat, and the air felt like a physical weight in my lungs. We found the kill site quickly. The tiger had shown incredible strength. He had snapped a rope of exceptional thickness, picked up the young buffalo, and headed straight down into the valley. Following a drag like this is a test of both nerves and endurance. A tiger with a kill is a tiger at its most territorial. He isn't just a predator at that point. He is a defender of his prize. We set off, with 2 men following close behind to carry our lunch and water, moving into a landscape that seemed determined to stop us. The trail led us through 2 miles of the most difficult terrain I have ever encountered in the Kumaon hills. It wasn't a simple path. It was a vertical descent through a chaotic nightmare of nature. We pushed through dense, tangled undergrowth where every branch seemed to catch at our clothes. We navigated deep beds of stinging nettles that burned through our trousers and waded through thickets of wild raspberry bushes whose thorns acted like miniature fishhooks. There is a specific silence that falls when you are tracking a man-eater. You stop listening to the forest and start listening to the gaps in the forest's own noise. Every snap of a dry twig or the rustle of a leaf becomes a potential final warning. We climbed over great masses of jagged rock and crawled under fallen giants of the forest, massive sal trees that had been brought down by the monsoon floods of previous years. The tiger had been relentless. He hadn't stopped to feed, nor had he dropped the kill to rest. He was making for a very specific, very secluded spot. Finally, the trail led us into a small, sheltered hollow. In the center of this depression stood a box tree, its branches spreading out in a perfect circle, giving it the distinct shape of a giant umbrella. Underneath this natural canopy, the tiger had finally deposited the buffalo. It was a secluded, shaded spot, a perfect dining room for a killer. As I stood there, looking at the carcass, a sense of unease settled over me. The buffalo had been killed the previous night, yet the tiger hadn't taken a single bite. This is a very disquieting sign for any hunter. It usually means one of 2 things. Either the tiger is not hungry, which is rare for a large male after such a long drag, or he is fully aware that he is being followed and is waiting nearby to see who is on his trail. I realized then that the tiger knew exactly who I was. He had survived our previous encounters at the Jamun tree and the Bottleneck ravine. He was no longer just a beast of instinct. He was an adversary. I began to scan the surrounding area for a place to sit. My body was screaming for rest, but the hunt demanded total focus. We were deep in the heart of the Lade Valley, far from the safety of Chuka, and the shadows were already beginning to lengthen to the right. About 60 yards away, I spotted a giant of the forest that had long since rotted away. But in its place, a parasite had grown. A ficus tree had woven its trellis around the old trunk. forming a new, hollowed-out pillar of wood. It leaned away from the hillside at a sharp, 45-degree angle, a strange, precarious perch. I decided then that this leaning tree would be my station for the night. I had no way of knowing then that by the time the sun rose again, I would be closer to a man-eater than any human being should ever be and live to tell the tale. I stood in the shadowed hollow, looking at the untouched kill. I knew the window of opportunity was closing. The sun was beginning its descent. I turned my attention back to the leaning ficus tree I had spotted earlier. In these jungles, the ficus is a fascinating killer. It starts as a parasite, a seed dropped by a bird into the high branches. From there, it sends down a trellis of roots that slowly over decades weave a wooden cage around its parent until the original tree is strangled and rots away. What remained here was a hollowed pillar of woven wood leaning away from the hill at a precarious 45-degree angle. It was a strange, skeletal structure, but it offered the only vantage point I had. To make this work, we needed to deceive an animal that was already suspicious. I asked Ibbotson to take the two men about 60 yards to our right. I wanted them to climb a different tree, one that was more obvious, and make a great show of shaking the branches and talking loudly, as if they were constructing a machan. This is a common tactic, meant to lead the tiger into believing the threat is concentrated in one spot, while I slipped silently into my real hideout as Ibbotson and the men moved off, their voices echoing through the trees, and I began my climb into the ficus. It wasn't an easy ascent. The wood was slick in places and rough in others, and because of the angle, I had to use every ounce of my remaining strength to haul myself up 10 feet from the ground. I found a spot where the trellis had stopped its growth, leaving a small opening where the parent tree had once stood. It was less of a seat and more of a sloping ledge, cushioned with a thick layer of rotten wood and dead leaves that had collected over the years. My first instinct was to brush the debris away to make myself more comfortable, but I stopped. The sound of dry leaves crackling under my hand would have been like a gunshot in the silence of that hollow. I also had to contend with the local inhabitants of such rotted wood. In the Kumaon hills, a hollowed-out tree is often a sanctuary for scorpions and snakes seeking relief from the heat. I sat down very slowly, my heart hammering against my ribs, hoping devoutly that I wasn't settling onto a nest of something venomous. I placed my feet into the openings of the wooden trellis, bracing myself against the forward slope to keep from sliding out. Once I was settled, Ibbotson called the men off their tree, and they began to walk away, their voices fading into the distance. Now, the silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence. It was the heavy, expectant quiet of the deep jungle. About 15 minutes passed. I sat perfectly still, my eyes scanning the dense undergrowth and the steep hillside behind me. Then, from the far side of the valley, a red monkey started to bark. Monkeys are blessed with some of the keenest eyesight in the jungle. From his high perch a quarter-mile away, he could see movements that were invisible to me. His bark was a rhythmic, persistent warning. The tiger was on the move. The monkey hadn't called when we first arrived, which confirmed my worst suspicion. The tiger hadn't been miles away. He had been right there the whole time, watching us from the shadows. Now, he was coming to investigate. A few moments later, the sound I had been waiting for reached my ears, a single, sharp snap of a dry stick on the steep hillside directly behind my tree. It's a sound that stops your breath. I couldn't turn my body without making the rotted wood beneath me groan, so I slowly, painfully shifted my head to the right. Looking through the gaps in the ficus trellis, I saw him. He was standing about 40 yards away, a magnificent, terrifying presence against the green. He wasn't looking at me. His eyes were fixed on the tree Ibbotson had prepared. The diversion had worked. He began to move. I watched him with a mix of awe and dread. A human being could not have crossed that broken rock-strewn ground without creating a cacophony of noise, but the tiger moved like a shadow. He didn't just walk. He seemed to flow over the terrain, his belly low to the earth, his paws finding the silent spots between the dry leaves. He crept toward the base of my bank and then disappeared from my sight as he moved directly under the lean of my tree. I waited for him to reappear on my left, headed for the kill. But the seconds turned into minutes, and he didn't emerge. Then I heard a sound that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. It was the distinct rustle of dry leaves being crushed directly beneath me. The tiger wasn't going to the buffalo. He had decided that the deep shade under my leaning tree was the perfect place to lie down and wait for the night. He was now less than 10 feet below me, separated only by a few inches of rotted wood and the open air. I was no longer the hunter. I was a passenger on a tree that was now shared with a man-eater. The situation I found myself in was as surreal as it was perilous. 10 feet below me, the Chuka man-eater, the animal that had turned the Ladia Valley into a graveyard, was settling in for a nap. I could hear the rhythmic, heavy breathing of a massive predator at rest. Every few seconds, the sound of a large paw shifting against the dry leaves sent a vibration up the rotted trunk of the ficus tree and into my own bones. The physical toll of the weight was becoming immense. Because the tree leaned at such a steep 45-degree angle, I was constantly fighting gravity. My feet wedged into the trellis to prevent me from sliding face first onto the tiger's back. My muscles were cramped, and a dull ache began to spread through my shoulders. But I didn't dare shift an inch. I slowly leaned my head to the right, craning my neck until I could see through a gap in the wooden cage of the tree. There he was. His chin was resting on the earth, and his eyes were closed. After a moment, he opened them, blinking lazily as he watched a few flies circle his head. Then he closed them again and surrendered to sleep. I have often said that a tiger is a magnificent, big-hearted animal, and there is something fundamentally hateful about the idea of shooting a sleeping creature. In any other circumstance, I would have waited for him to stand, to give him a fair chance. But as I looked down at those orange and black stripes, I remembered the red cap in the dark ravine. I remembered the 10-year-old boy sobbing at the feet of the village elders. This wasn't a game of sportsmanship. This was an execution required for the survival of the people of Thok. I turned my attention to the shot. This is where the physics of the hunt became a nightmare, because I was sitting in a tree that leaned forward, and the tiger was directly beneath that lean. I couldn't simply point the rifle down. The muzzle of my .450-400 was too long. If I tried to depress it enough to hit his head, the barrel would strike the trellis of the tree. I was trapped by the very structure that protected me. I shifted my gaze to the left. On that side, there was no trellis. If I leaned out far enough, risking my balance entirely, I could see the rear third of the tiger. I could see most of his tail and the curve of one massive hind leg. The decision was made. I would have to break his back to disable him, then finish the job before he could recover. I took a deep breath, trying to steady the adrenaline that was now coursing through me. I released my grip on the tree, gripped the rifle with both hands, and leaned out into the empty air. I was looking under the sights. Not over them a shot I hope never to repeat. I squeezed the trigger. The roar of the high-velocity rifle in that small hollow was deafening. The recoil was violent because of my awkward angle. The butt of the rifle kicked upward toward the sky, nearly snapping my wrist and bruising my fingers. Below me, the world exploded into motion. The tiger threw the upper half of his body around, a silent, blurred mass of power, and began to slide down the steep hillside on his back. I didn't wait. I swung the rifle around and fired the second barrel into his chest as he slid. There was no roar, no snarl of defiance. He was a big-hearted animal to the very end. He simply took the impact and came to rest in the tall grass at the bottom of the slope. Silence returned to the hollow, heavier than before. I stayed in the tree for a long time, my heart hammering, waiting for a movement that never came. Ibbotson, hearing the 2 shots, came hurrying through the brush, and together we walked down to where the tiger lay. He was a prime male, a beautiful specimen of his kind. We measured him as best we could without a tape, 9 feet 6 inches from nose to tail. When I pried open his heavy jaws, I found the final proof. The right canine tooth in his lower jaw was shattered, the signature of the Chuka man-eater. The news that the tiger was dead traveled through the hills with the speed of a mountain breeze. By the next morning, as we prepared to skin the animal under the shade of the ficus tree, more than 100 men and boys had gathered. They came from Chuka, from Thak, and from the outlying settlements, their faces transformed by a relief that words cannot describe. Among them was a 10-year-old boy, the brother of the tiger's final victim. He stood at the edge of the crowd, his eyes wide as he looked at the red animal that had taken his family away. I watched him as he reached out a small, trembling hand to touch the tiger's fur. In that moment, the shadow that had hung over the Ladia Valley for years finally lifted. The people could return to their fields. The children could play in the wheat stubble, and the heavy silence of fear was replaced by the sounds of a village coming back to life. My work here was done.